Okay, so I'm gonna wander and also relive my dreams of being Oprah Winfrey with this big microphone. It never quite happened, but whatever. So the title of my presentation is Inverted Influence, Blacks, Whites, and Difficult Conversations About Race. And yes, this is about dialogue, but this also is gonna connect to the previous panel related to hidden influence and hidden motives. So to begin, a couple months ago, I was giving a talk at a financial firm on Wall Street. And what was interesting about this day was that it was geared towards Black vice presidents. So the entire room was mostly Black vice presidents. There were a few very high up white senior partners. And the goal of the day was to talk about how could they think about change and making things better for many individuals in the firm. One of the things that was happening was that there was a lot of talk and sort of chatter throughout the day about this incident that had happened just a few weeks before and just a few blocks away. James Blake, who is a former professional tennis player, he was racially profiled outside his hotel. For those of you who don't know, he was sort of violently thrown to the ground by a police officer. It was just a really sort of difficult scene. Many of these Black vice presidents were disturbed at the fact that many of these white partners either A, hadn't heard about this, or B, didn't really see it as related to race and sort of being able to tie it to the culture of the firm. So the goal of many of these Black vice presidents was to try to get them to understand not only this incident, but other incidents like it, and the sort of lack of sensitivity as being tied to the firm culture. What I observed, which is related to the research I'm going to talk about today, is two things. One is that it was many of the Black vice presidents who took the initiative to go up to the white partners and talk to them about this incident and really try to take the time to connect it to these issues related to the firm culture. But the second thing was that some Black vice presidents were better or more effective than other vice presidents at trying to sort of engage in this transformation. And some of them were really effective at sort of leading those sort of white senior partners to get it. And what I am really interested in is this individual difference variable, trying to unpack the science underlying how and why some of these Black professionals are better than others, and to understand what they're doing and why. So I'm going to give you the sort of take-home message today that in these experiments that I'm going to share with you, the main idea is for difficult conversations about race, some Black Americans are better than others at effectively communicating with whites. I'm going to talk about a personality construct called implicit power that distinguishes Blacks who are more effective communicators from ones who are less effective. And in this context, effective communication means reducing whites' level of anxiety, both at the explicit and implicit level, increasing openness and motivation to learn about race. So in order to have these conversations about race, we sort of need to back away for a minute and talk about motivation, and in particular, talk about our human motivation system in terms of implicit motives. So this is a really sort of complex figure. I love these iceberg things. You can use them for diversity and identity and all kinds of stuff. So, but here, I just want to sort of point out two things. That most people think about motivation at the explicit level. When you're sort of getting up in the morning, you're figuring out what you're going to wear, whether or not you're going to give a talk, whether or not you're going to go for that next job. People think about it in terms of explicit rewards, how much money you're getting paid or not, or explicit punishments. But what this figure illuminates is that most, at least 80 or 90% of motivation is implicit, it's non-conscious, it happens outside of our awareness. And so this is the world in which the work that I'm going to talk about today lives, that we have these implicit hidden motives, a lot of which was sort of illuminated in the talk earlier. So I want to give a definition of implicit motives, and I'll talk a little about what it is and how we study it. It's defined as an enduring, non-conscious driver that motivates a person's behavior toward the attainment of a specific social incentive, or the way I like to think about it is like some psychological goodie. And so what you have is you have a behavior, the thing that you can see, like me walking around. You have the driver, which is the hidden motive underlying it, and then it's usually given a label. So there's different kinds of implicit motives. What's interesting, I never in my lifetime thought I'd be talking about this here. Much of this work was developed by David McClellan right here at Harvard. So when you think of implicit power, you're thinking about the idea of trying to be promoted to, say, supervise a larger area of a firm. That's the explicit behavior that you can see. The implicit sort of hidden driver is this drive to seek influence, to be impactful on others, and this would be called implicit power. So I'm going to talk about this explicit, sort of implicit goal today, but I can talk about the other ones. There's other implicit motives, implicit affiliation, the sort of drive to connect and be connected with others, as well as implicit achievement, which is what Dave McClellan mostly studied, the sort of drive to perform and be seen as competent. So what do implicit motives do? They do something that's very important for us. They do two things. They energize us, and they orient our attention to particular situations. So by energizing us, what this means is that it arouses us, it makes us excited, it makes us energized in situations that align with our motives. So for example, a person who is high in implicit power, if they have the opportunity to mentor someone or potentially donate blood, that this is energizing, it's arousing. When you look at some of the physiological data, at least for men in particular, they're higher in levels of testosterone, it's something that energizes them. It also orients your attention to situations. So it's not that people who have this are sort of passive recipients of situations. People that have these implicit motives, they are finding and seeking out opportunities in which they're actually working for them. So people that are high in implicit power will find situations in which they can be influential and impactful. So in this way, it's a very organism type model. It's not that people are recipients of behavior, they're going around seeking and finding this behavior. So I'm going to focus today on implicit power, but in our data, we actually measure all of these motives, so I can talk about that later if anyone has any questions. So how do you measure implicit motives? And again, I can't believe I sort of was trained at Stanford, not a very sort of psychodynamic background. This makes me really uncomfortable to talk about this. But nevertheless, I'll tell you the story about how our lab started doing this work. The question is, how do you measure implicit power? And the sort of formal definition is that you derive pleasure from influencing and impacting others. It kind of looks like a thematic apperception kind of Rorschach sort of thing. So this is how it works. You'll have a picture. This is one of the pictures that we use. There's an official coding manual. It was developed in the mid-1960s. It's over 100 pages. It takes 6 weeks for each person to be trained in this. I now have like 20 motive coders in my lab. But what happens is you just simply write a story about this. It has nothing to do with race. You just sort of write a story about this. So this is a little story I ran on the train yesterday. I'll read a few sentences. The man with the hat gets on the ship to wish his wife one last goodbye. The captain commands him to get off the ship because it's about to leave port. The man is pretending to listen, and all the while is plotting to stay on the ship to find his wife and say his last goodbye. Okay, so I made this up, and then I sent it to my motive coders. What they do is that they look for, if related to this manual, it sort of tells you which are the phrases that are related to influencing, impacting others, giving advice without soliciting help. So this would have approximately 7 different power phrases in it. So again, the idea is that I already know this research, so I probably like peppered it already with power statements. But if you don't know it, this is the coding. What you can then determine is whether someone is high or low in implicit motives. Hence, it's a sort of personality characteristic. What we know is that's normally distributed throughout the population, and there don't seem to be gender differences in terms of implicit power, who's high or low or what have you. Although people do gravitate to situations in which they are higher in implicit power. So these are the pictures that we used in our experiment when we used the picture story exercise. And I'm not entirely positive, but I think that the one on the bottom left is actually the Charles River. Is that in fact true? Yes, very, this was from Dave McClellan's original man, right? He would like that, right? See? And so these are the original pictures that our Black participants wrote stories about. So we had this sort of working hypothesis at the time, my graduate student Ruth Dillman and I, and we were thinking, okay, we know that there's a variable out there that can determine whether or not one particular group of people is better at influencing individuals than others. Let's sort of put this in the context of race. And so we had this working hypothesis, this possibility that we could take individuals who were Black Americans. We could put them in a context where they're trying to talk about race. They're trying to talk about race or identity. We thought that we could measure their implicit motives. We could determine who actually has the goal to influence or impact that conversation. There's one little other piece to implicit motives, is that implicit motives don't just happen all the time. So if someone who's high power is not just like sitting on the couch being, oh, I'm high power. What happens is they have to be in a situation where they can be influential. What better context to be influential than one of the most difficult conversations to have in the United States, and that's about slavery in America. And so we created a context where there were always Black and white Americans that were talking about the history of the institution of slavery. And while in many respects this is a little bit devoid from issues related to leadership, what corporations have done in the past and where they generate their wealth from, and how does that influence how they run their firms today, actually has a lot to do with some of the things we're talking about at HBS. So what I want to do is we have this sort of working hypothesis, we have this working model, and so I want to run through, I'll get through at least two, but I have sort of 3 experiments that try to offer some evidence that there are some Black Americans that are better than others at trying to get through these very difficult conversations about race. In this first experiment, these are just, these are undergraduates, but I can tell you some other data that we have with older adults. And our methodology looks something like this. So they come into the laboratory at time 1, and they complete this picture story exercise. And actually, it's totally fun. People actually really like to do it. And so they're looking at the man in the hat, and they're writing all these stories. It takes about an hour, and then they go home. We then have them come back a couple weeks later, and we match them with a white student. These are matched dyadic pairs. In this experiment, we had 68 dyads. They're always gender-matched pairs. So it's a Black man with a white man or a Black woman with a white woman. And we have them engage in a 20-minute conversation where they're supposed to talk about whether the history of slavery is something that's appropriate to talk about in middle school, particularly with sort of very visual, difficult images to look at. So this is what they're supposed to talk about for 20 minutes. We then separate them, and what I'd like to show you is what is the effect of this conversation for the white participants in terms of how comfortable they feel and also their recall. Do they actually remember what the Black participant is actually saying? One of the things we know in intergroup dialogues is that one of the things that happens is people go, yeah, I feel so good. And it's like, well, what did the person say? And they actually don't remember, which is why they actually feel good. So we were interested in recall as a measure of the motivation on the parts of whites. So one of the things I just want to show you very quickly, most of the data on implicit motives is done on whites and mostly in Europe. Our coders are just as accurate as the European data. All of this data looks exactly the same. So just to say that we were pretty successful at getting this implicit motive paradigm going in our laboratory. And also, I believe it's one of the first experiments that's actually conducted using subordinate group members to look at implicit power, which is, I think, kind of interesting. So the first thing that I thought I'd do is just show you a little bit of qualitative data, like what are people actually saying. So I just want to show you one little snippet of a Black-white discussion. So here's a white partner, and they're supposed to be talking about middle school. Every conversation always meanders into affirmative action. So this is what this white partner says. She says, I don't know. The thing about affirmative action, because if you say there has to be, we're going to admit a certain amount of Black people, whether or not they're really qualified. Well, what is that based on? It's just based on, all right, well, we have to admit a certain amount of Black people. Okay, so this is just typical. This actually happens quite a bit. So this is a comment from a high implicit power Black American. At the time, they don't know that they're a high implicit power. We never tell them. But when we go back and look at the transcriptions of the videos, this is what she says. Does that even happen though? Let's think this through together. If you look at a school like Columbia, where the top 90% of people get within the top bracket of the SAT ranges, and we're a school where 54% are people of color, I'm not sure that happens. Also, in talking about the legacy of slavery, now this is really hard to discuss, I'd love to think that it's no longer relevant, but we live in a context that's built off of so much inequality. So in my second study, I'll sort of unpack what is it they're actually saying, but you could see that there's some kind of things that are happening here. The first question of interest is, what are whites' reactions as a function of what the black partners are saying and doing, and whether that's moderated or modulated by implicit motives. So the first thing that I wanted to look at is I just want to look at comfort. Self-report measures how comfortable do you feel, how relaxed, how anxious, just at the explicit level, as a function of who your partner is and whether your partner is high or low in implicit power. So on the x-axis here, you have the black partner's power motives are either low or high, and on the y-axis you have comfort. So we know from the research that implicit power is activated in a situational context that's relevant. In the control condition, we had them talking about the environment. And we had them talking about whether environmental atrocities should be talked about in middle school. And we hypothesized that this would not be a particular context that's sort of relevant, that for black participants anyway, where power needs to be aroused and activated. And interestingly, what we find is that there really is no effective condition, regardless of whether black partners have high or low implicit motives. There's really no difference in white levels of comfort. Oh, there's a big hole right there. That's interesting. You're looking at it, right? Yeah, me too. However, in the condition where they're talking about slavery, we get this significant interaction such that now white partners who are talking to black partners who we know are high in implicit power actually report feeling more comfortable even after a really difficult 20-minute conversation about the history of slavery. So then we looked at, okay, well, they say that they're feeling comfortable. What do they actually remember? So here on the y-axis, now we're looking at the number of words from a memory task from like just a 2-minute snippet that we took from the video. What you find is in the control condition, where there's a conversation going about the environment, if anything, when it's a high power black participant, the whites actually remember slightly less. That's not significant, it's just a trend. However, again, you get this significant interaction when a white partner is talking to a black partner that we know is high in implicit power. You now find that the white individual is remembering more of what they're saying. What's interesting is that for the black partners who are low in implicit power, they actually remember less. So, and these are Columbia students. Allegedly, they're very educated, although I just realized that half of them just failed the midterm I gave on Monday. But you see that something is going on. There's something that these high implicit power blacks are doing that is getting their attention. Okay, so one of the other things that we did is that, as I said at the end of the experiment, we separated the whites and the blacks, and I wanted to just show you a little bit of data about what are the black participants, what are their drivers or motivation, what are they saying was their goal in that context. And so we know that implicit motives are non-conscious, but we could ask people, like, what was your goal in the conversation? What were you trying to get out of it? And that's some of the data that I want to show you. So now what we're looking at are self-reports of the black participants when they ended the conversation about either slavery or about the environment. What did they say their goal was? In the control condition, there's no significant difference in whether they're reporting that their goal was to be warm and friendly. However, among high power black participants, only in the context where they're talking about slavery, they're saying, hey, my goal here was to be warm. My goal here was to be friendly. So we can see this modulation effect, that high implicit power blacks are doing something in particular. It's happening at the non-conscious level, but they're saying that they're trying to be warm. They're trying to sort of actually engage in some kind of affiliation. Okay. finally, this is just a little bit of data that I just ran literally last night, so we probably have to double check this, but I thought I would show you a little bit of the nonverbal data. We have these videos, these are very, very long videos, and what we did is that we coded them for what are called immediacy behaviors, whether you're leaning forward and sitting up straight. And what we find is, again, we find the significant interaction. The black participants, when they're talking to whites only about the history of slavery, they engage in more immediacy behaviors, meaning they're leaning over more and they're sitting up straighter, which we know from the earlier work on implicit power is a sort of dominant pose. It's a way to sort of engage and influence. Okay, so we have sort of some evidence, I think, that this model is working. I don't know what that says. Oh, 2 minutes. That says, okay, we have some evidence. I'll just show you one other experiment. In study 2, what we did is we wanted to understand what it was that black participants are doing for those that are high in implicit power. So we just here focused on only the black students. Just as like in study 1, we had them come into the lab. They're all black American. They did the picture story exercise at time 2. What we did is that we had them watch a 12-minute video clip about the history of slavery in one condition or the Swiss Alps in another condition. The idea is that it was just so boring, but what we wanted to do is just sort of arouse the context of slavery or not. And then we had them engage in a simulated intergroup letter exchange, which means that they thought that a white participant was in the other room, and they just had to write a letter about the history of race and how slavery affects their relationships today. This is the video, it's sort of narrated by Morgan Freeman with his voice, and it's all, you know, it's not too bad, but it's not particularly violent. One of the things that we did is that we used another one of David Winters and Dave McClellan's coding manuals to try to get at what is it that these black participants are actually doing. And we found something really interesting. One of the things that we find is that regardless of whether there's high or low power, everyone is using sort of this agency kind of statements, that they're concerned about impact, they're concerned about achievement. So for example, you profited based on the blood and tears of my ancestors. The other thing that we find is that there's these like affiliation connectedness statements, concerns about relationships. One participant said in 2014, we must move forward with love and positivity. The question of interest is this modulated by the context and by implicit power? The answer to this question is yes, in the following way. So now what you're looking at is the number of affiliation expressions about connection, about maintaining relationships. In the control condition, regardless of whether black participants are high or low in implicit power, there's no difference in the number of these statements in the letter. However, in the slave clip condition, after watching slavery and then having to talk about the implications of it for race today, blacks that are high in implicit power are more likely to use the types of statements that try to connect themselves to whites. For example, we must move forward in love and positivity. I want to end with just sort of one other piece of data, that when you look at these agentic statements, this concern about impact, this concern about just sort of kind of telling it like it is, it's sort of like a more direct strategy. For instance, you sort of benefited on the blood, sweat, and tears of my ancestors. There's no significant interaction, and it's actually very high. So it's not the case that blacks are sort of selling out, if you will. What they're doing is they're using a combination of sort of telling it like it is, and then sort of sprinkling it with affiliation, with connection. And so one of the things that we're thinking about is that there's something about making your partner feel open to these sort of very difficult conversations that can sort of move us forward. What I'm going to do is sort of end here, and what I'd like to end with is just a final statement, is that when we think about diversity and when we think about transformation, what I'd like to suggest is this data is telling us we need to think about precision. Sort of not like any old black person will do, right? But we need to think about who we need, in what context, and what are they actually saying. The second thing I want to leave with is that we don't necessarily need a whole bunch of implicit motive coders. What we need is to pay attention to transformation from the bottom up. What are they actually saying, and what are they doing? And can we learn something from them to think about transformation with respect to race? So with that, I will end, and thank you.